Chapter 33, Section 2 continued. The number of Viet Cong was going to continue to grow in number, especially as the bombing continued. Soon we were fighting more South Vietnamese, Viet Cong, than we were the North. And it becomes very apparent that we're going to have to launch a ground war. And so the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam is going to grow from 185,000 in 1965 to close to 500,000 by 1967. The Viet Cong are aided by the regular North Vietnamese army. And the Viet Cong would strike our patrols, they would strike the government villages, and then they would disappear. You had peasants who were peaceful by day, selling their wares to U.S. troops, that by night were the enemy. And so this made Vietnam a particularly hard war for us to fight because we didn't know who the enemy was. They could be young, they could be old, male, female, you didn't know. We're going to have to use search and destroy missions to try to drive the Viet Cong out of hiding. Simple idea. We'd go in, we'd look for the Viet Cong. Once we find out where the Viet Cong are located, we would call in airstrikes and then move on to the next job, trying to find more Viet Cong. Our forces do not have an easy job. The Viet Cong were using booby traps, they were using snipers. We'd go into villages that we'd clear, no Viet Cong. As soon as we leave, the Viet Cong would re-enter the village. Very difficult job. And we're going to employ a strategy called pacification to try to maintain security. With pacification, we would take the residents out of the village, the ones who we knew weren't Viet Cong. We'd move them to a secure location, a government village or whatever, and then we'd burn the village. That way there was nothing for the Viet Cong to come back to. Now, most of the villagers dislike this plan. We're burning their homes. Homes that might have been their homes for generations. It ends up, this program was so full of failure that the U.S. officials abandoned it after a while. I mean, it was hard to tell if this program was working or creating more enemies. The U.S. soldier in the beginning of this fight was very optimistic, was very hopeful. I mean, the United States doesn't lose wars. We hadn't in our history. And as the war drags on, longer and longer, and we're getting stuck in this quagmire even farther, you see that hope start to fade. The enemy's not quitting. Here we are in 1967, and we're no closer to victory than we were in 1963. The only thing that's growing was the number of Americans killed so far. By the end of 67, around 16,000 Americans have been killed so far. And here at home, Vietnam is going to be viewed different from any other war. I mean, the press was given access to the war. They went on missions with the soldiers. They went to the villages. They interviewed the people of South Vietnam. Americans at home could view for themselves what was going on in Vietnam. And at times, it seemed contradictory to what the government was saying was going on in Vietnam. You're going to start seeing the war effort being criticized by multiple sides. Look, doves. Doves was a nickname given to the people who opposed the war. Doves obviously are going to criticize the war. Variety of reasons. Martin Luther King Jr., he was on the side that the war was wrong. You've got others that were afraid that it could end up with the use of nuclear weapons. You got others saying, if we're fighting people in Vietnam that we're supposed to be helping, why are we even there? Lots of different reasons doves would criticize the war. But you're going to start seeing the hawks criticizing the war as well. The hawks did think we should be in Vietnam. They supported the war's goals. But they were criticizing the way the war was being fought. They said, if we're going to win this, we need more troops, we need more bombing. The hawks said, we're the most powerful nation in the world, but we're afraid to use that power. So you are going to see at home, you're going to see an anti-war movement starting to grow. Made up of numerous groups, but probably the biggest group that's going to make up the anti-war movement was the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. By 65, they had members on 124 different college campuses. And they held rallies and they held debates about the war. They actually organized the first anti-war national demonstration. April 17, 1965, in Washington, D.C., about 20,000 people, participated in it. We've already mentioned civil rights activists were critics of the war. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr., he was angry that money was being diverted to Vietnam that could be used here at home to help solve poverty issues here. The SNCC was angry because they said it's unfair that there's such a high percentage of African Americans being drafted to go fight and give another country rights that African Americans didn't even have completely here. So you're going to see a variety of anti-war movements here. The anti-war protesters were highly visible, but they did not make up a majority of the U.S. population, contrary to what some people think. Many people actually opposed the anti-war movement, especially some of those extreme groups. There were a lot of people that viewed fighting for our country as patriotic. And they didn't like the tactics that the protesters would use. They're burning flags, they're taking over government buildings, the people burning their draft cards. Many veterans of past wars were particularly upset. This wasn't what they had fought for in World War II or even World War I at this time. And you did see some rallies that were in support of the war with signs like America, love it or leave it, or my country, right or wrong, it's my country. So the government has some real issues to deal with here. Not only can they not seem to figure out what they need to be doing in Vietnam, but they're getting a growing criticism here at home that they have to deal with. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, he simply said, here's the thing. We're helping an ally. Simple as that. South Vietnam's our ally. They asked for help. We have to help. If we don't help, what ally of ours would ever trust us again? But some of the criticism was actually coming from within Congress. J. William Fulbright, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. He was a senator, a very powerful senator. And he was a critic of Johnson's policies. And in 1966, he begins holding hearings about this war.